PowerPoint, yeah. Just get the
Interesting, because I usually talk to US audiences and I realize there's so many people there's like zero context for some of the stuff.
Oh, yeah,
whereas
yeah.
a lot of like US folks are kind of to that.
Yep.
It's a little bit of imbalance.
Yeah. I came to an event in 2016 at Simulax and
Oh, yeah.
I was amazed at how, I understand Fletcher School is international,
Yeah.
but I was amazed just at the diversity
Yeah,
of folks that attended, and then not only that, but the student body here. It's really fascinating.
Yeah.
But you're right, it's a challenge. There's a lot of things just don't happen. So we take this stuff for granted. We know what the constitutional system. A lot of folks are trying to
I just didn't know how to click, like what I would use to change over. But I think some of the tech people, I wasn't sure who was doing it, but they already loaded it.
Okay, they already loaded it.
I just didn't know who would switch it over, or if I needed to do that. The woman who has short hair, I don't know her name.
yeah.
I think she was here with one of the tech guys.
PowerPoint, is that it?
Yeah.
Okay, I did see it up before. All right, so I don't know what I just took down from. Is that it? Oh.
But we want to be in the slideshow, or I'll do slideshow when I get.
Yeah.
I think someone will come in to set it up.
Okay.
Slideshow.
All right.
Where it
I
is.
think they do it.
They'll do it.
Okay. All right, I'll tell them to do it.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay. How do you put this back on the slide?
It's okay.
All right. Huh? Expand. Okay, thank you. Sorry,
You're more
I'm
tech savvy than
Apple.
I am. Are you kidding me? Whenever I'm like, when I'm in class and I'm like, I have these horribly embarrassing moments. I've never felt older in my life. When one of those pops up and I'm like, I know what I'm doing. All the students are like, you're an old idiot. Like, what do you?
Okay, why don't you start? And I've got it'll help me get
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. I don't think it's working. Yeah, good afternoon. Hello? Work? It's on. Sorry. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. We'll start shortly. If you could please all sit down, and we'll begin the last panel of the symposium. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Okay. My name is Guillaume Pailhoux, and I'm a sophomore student from France, studying international relations and economics. I'm a member of this year's EPIIC class, and I will be moderating today's panel. I'm very happy to welcome you to the last panel of the 34th annual Norris and Marjorie Beditson EPIIC International Symposium. In this session, entitled Movement and Order to Securitization of Migration, we'll discuss how migratory flows have often been focused on as a security issue, rather than as a humanitarian or economic issue. In both the United States and Europe, migrants have been called names such as invaders, animals, and their arrivals have been likened to the breach of national borders, invasions, and a dilution of a country's culture. While this is not a new phenomenon, it is important to look at factors that have helped contribute to its intensification over the past few years in the United States and Europe, including by looking at the role of political rhetoric and the media. This topic was chosen to be a part of the symposium, as this phenomenon has greatly impacted the way migrants are seen by the population and how migration is addressed by policymakers. Understanding why and how migrants are considered to be a threat to the receiving nation is an integral part of obtaining a clearer image of migration in our current world, as well as developing policies to address it. Our class believed that it was crucial that we brought different perspectives that would highlight the complexity of this phenomenon and try to dissect it from both an American and a European perspective. We will look at how migration has become securitized and how national military forces are used to contend with a problem previously left more to police or border enforcement agencies. Then we will consider historical perspectives on how migration and enforcement efforts have changed over time at the US-Mexico border. We will focus more deeply on the treatment of migration at the US-Mexico border and the implications for human rights. Finally, we will discuss similarities and differences by considering the European perspective on securitization of migration following the migration crisis of 2015. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to briefly explain how this panel will run. Each panelist has been asked to speak for 12 minutes, essentially an oral op-ed, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. Now I would like to introduce our first panelist. Dr. Ryan Burke is an associate professor of military and strategic studies at the US Air Force Academy. Prior to his academic pursuits, Dr. Burke was a captain and logistics officer in the US Marine Corps, where he served as a platoon commander, operations officer, and company commander. He has published multiple essays on the use of the military to secure the US-Mexico border, which were published in The Hill and Modern War Institute. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Ryan Burke.
Just test this real quick. Doesn't seem like it is.
Doesn't seem like it.
Are we on now? I can do this without the mic. That's good. Okay, we got it. Okay. First of all, I want to thank everybody for having me here. Thank you specifically to the IGL faculty, staff, and students for coordinating the event. I'm always enjoying my time in Boston. I get to come and visit some family, so it's a great time to be here. I've been asked to start my remarks and just talk a little bit about the militarization of the ongoing border security issue down on the southwest border. My intent is to talk a little bit about the mechanics of what the military has actually been asked to do, and what I have to do is stay as objective and centrist as I possibly can, given the fact that I am a federal employee. That said, I welcome all the questions that anybody's interested in asking me toward the end of my remarks, or I guess whenever the panel is moving into the question and answer phase. Understand, though, that I have to, this is a political issue, it's a heavily debated and partisan issue as well, but I do have to remain as nonpartisan as possible, given my status as a federal employee. With that said, I'm going to start out with posing a true-false question to the audience, and it's just a rhetorical question for you to think about. So the statement is, think about if this statement is true or false. Illegal immigration is a transnational threat to U.S. national security. True or false? Just think about it as I go through my remarks. I think this no doubt elicits myriad emotions from probably everybody in the audience, as it well should, depending on one's perspective, whether or not you're a consumer of, let's say, Fox News or MSNBC or any other news source that you happen to choose to consume. I'm not here to align to one perspective or another, or really tug on emotional heartstrings. The fact is that I'm here to provide context for, again, what the military can and can't do and what it's been asked to do and whether those things that it's been asked to do are in fact legal or not. And what I'm trying to do is remove emotion from the remarks and comments to the extent possible. Right? I'm looking at the objective facts, the laws, the policies as they're written and as they've been implemented and as they're intended. My statements are, again, designed to separate emotion from the equation and focus on the facts, albeit the popular narrative aside. I'm certainly aware that some of the things I'm about to say are not consistent with the popular narrative, not consistent with the accepted narrative probably around the country. But the fact is, again, once you hear some of the things that I've got to say, I'm sure you'll at least think about this in a more nuanced fashion, which is the intent. I'll focus my remarks on three things. The first will be the policy and legalistic aspects of, again, the military role in securing the border, or at least operating domestically. I'll then look at the narrative that the president and the administration has used to frame this debate, frame this approach, again, using the military. And then I'll tie it up with a brief discussion on the theoretical underpinnings that I believe, in my assessment, that the president is using to more or less justify the approach for using the military to secure the southern border. I'm not here, again, to tell you what the military should or should not do. I'm simply here to tell you what the military can and can't do. All right? You can make your own opinions and your own informed assessments based on my comments at the end. But that'll come back to the true-false question that we started at in the beginning. It should come as no surprise that the answer is, in fact, true to the Trump administration. The Homeland Defense Doctrine, published in April 2018, it's a joint publication 3TAC27 for anybody who's interested in looking it up. It actually states that exact phrase as a national security threat. It says ongoing illegal immigration is in fact a threat to, or transnational threat to U.S. national security. Again, it's not making it up, it's black and white in a document that the administration has signed off on. The fact is that the president ran on this campaign promise. It was certainly not a surprise to anybody. He ran on this campaign promise to address border porosity. The fact that he's departing from the norms of the office, the presidential norms of the office, really, again, shouldn't surprise anybody either, and I'll come back to some of the reasons why. He's written, he's stated, and he's most notably tweeted about his perception of the lawless state of the southern border. Many of these are quotes that I'm taking directly out of his writings. In late 2018, he stated that the migrant caravan was an invasion and was a threat to the sovereignty of U.S. territory and the security of our people. Again, not words that are coincidental. I'm guessing that they are, or my contention is, an argument is that they are, in fact, intentional. These keywords establish what I believe to be the basis and the foundation for what we've seen occurring really since November at the U.S. southern border, specifically with the U.S. military and their role in at least what the president believes to be securing the border. The fact is that we now have a militarized border. It's anybody's guess as to whether or not it will continue in this current fashion. I think that we can have a conversation, more substantive dialogue after my remarks are over about that particular issue. The first pillar of my discussion is the legal and policy aspects of this particular issue. Again, I want to separate the emotions from the assessment, look at just the facts, look at the words and the language of the policies and the law, and how it is in fact legal, again, albeit unpopular, but still nonetheless legal to use the military in the way that they have been used. We've seen media reports that undermine the accuracy or the legalistic aspects of this particular situation. We've seen headlines like Trump to send troops to the southern border to defend the border. We've seen other media headlines that say something to the effect of the border is going to be secured by the military. Again, security, defense, and military going to do all these things. We see these basic headlines repeated in a variety of capacities. The question that we ask is whether this is ignorance, that the media just simply doesn't understand what the military is actually doing, or whether it's propaganda. My contention is probably more the former than the latter. I think it's more ignorance because we just simply don't understand the mechanics, the legal and the policy aspects of the military's role, at least domestically. The fact is, again, there are multiple policies and laws that allow for the president to do exactly what he has been doing, again, albeit unpopular, but nonetheless legally. I'm not going to spend much time in going through all the mechanics of that. I don't have the time for it. If you're interested, please take a look at some of the writings that I've recently published. But suffice to say that there are more than a handful of constitutional exceptions to what we've all come to know as the Posse Comitatus Act, right? It's been referred to in the media on a regular basis, and simply referring to the Posse Comitatus Act, it doesn't tell the whole story. We can look at Homeland Defense Doctrine, which again outlines and identifies illegal immigration as a threat to U.S. national security. Homeland Defense Doctrine allows for the U.S. military to defend the homeland against external threats and aggression or any other threat that the president deems a threat to the sovereignty and security of the nation. Whether you like it or not, again, that's what it states. We can look at things like the Insurrection Act of 1807, again, a kind of a policy relic, a dated vestige of U.S. law that was largely implied or applied to restrict military forces and limit the president's power, but at the same time acts as a policy loophole, a legal loophole to the Posse Comitatus Act. Things as well as the Calling Forth Act, Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution. Again, I can go on and on and on about various things that allow for the president to engage in the mechanistic and legalistic enforcement or allowable enforcement of the border through U.S. military forces. I don't have the time for it again, but what I want to emphasize that it is the debates about the wisdom of using the military to secure the border are important, but they're undermined, at least in my contention, by a failure to get the law right, the law and the policy right. With that, we come to what I believe to be the narrative that's been shaped by the president and the administration. Presidential tweets like migrant caravan invasion, our 2018 November memo that the president stated we're going to protect the integrity of the southern border, put down violence and disorder. All these things, again, are words chosen for an intent, for a purpose, that if you start looking at some of the things and how they fit together, you can see exactly what he and his administration are trying or attempting to do. The State of the Union. He talks about, I'm sure everybody remembers this phrase if you watched it, but we're going to send troops down to the border to prepare for a, quote, tremendous onslaught. Again, make your own assessments or opinions as to whether or not you believe that it is in fact a tremendous onslaught, but the fact is that the president is laying the foundation through shaping a narrative for what he's doing and what he likely will continue to do, at least militarily, at the southern border. The National Security Strategy of 2017, the first pillar is protect the homeland. It states things to the effect of strengthen and control our southern borders, restore our sovereignty, and the list goes on and on and on. The fact is that, again, all these things are consistent with a campaign message that the president talked about, that he promised that he would follow through with. The last thing that provides the transition to the theoretical underpinnings of this is that if we look at the president's messaging and some of the published and or spoken word, he uses the phrase principled realism. Now, for the students in the room that are IR students, you know at least what the basics of realism are. We know that realism, the three central tenets of realism are anarchy, sovereignty, and power. Right? We live in an anarchic world without a central governing authority, such that we need sovereign borders to maintain our security, such that we need security and sovereignty to maintain and advance our power and our national interests. Right? If we understand basic realism theory, those are the central tenets of it. They're really undebated. The fact is, the president uses this term principled realism as a theoretical underpinning anyway, in my contention, to justify, at least in nebulous academic speak, what he's doing in a very practical manner. If you think about realism, what it actually is, we're trying to secure the southern border through the language that I've provided over the course of these last 10 minutes. This is really, in my contention, textbook realism. Again, I don't have the time or the intent to get into all the mechanics of it, but we have a situation where the president is shaping a narrative, using academic speak to support things, and it really, in my contention, it's predictable. It's legal, it's consistent with his narrative, and again, it is fairly predictable, albeit unpopular nonetheless. What does it all mean? In closing, the president's approach is unpopular, but it is legal. It's a normative departure, no doubt, from the past tradition and precedent of the office of the president. But the fact is that these norms of restraint established by tradition and precedent are simply insufficient to deter or dissuade a particularly motivated president in promising or making good on a campaign promise. He's not a normative president, we know that. The fact is that, again, he's shaping this narrative and this approach. He doesn't have to be normative because, in my contention, I don't believe he frankly cares about his political future, unlike some of the folks in the past. This is more about an issue with Congress and our current national security architecture, and my contention is dated. If we want to change these things, Congress is, in fact, the body that has the opportunity to change these laws. We can update them. We can restrict the president's power a little bit more if, in fact, that's what Congress believes they should do. In closing, I want to say that the pre-Trump narrative was about this, at least about using the border, was that it is, using military on the border, was that it is improbable, impermissible, and impractical. My contention is that the post-Trump narrative says that it's more probable, it's permissible, and depending on your perspective, it may even be practical. The bottom line, congressional ignorance or apathy created the national security architecture that we see today that is ripe for manipulation. The media narrative continues to use emotion to influence, to misinform and mislead the population, at least in my contention, and possibly even manipulate your assessment. And the fact is that the military is, in my opinion, it should be above the manipulation game. The military is the most trusted institution, and we need to keep it that way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ryan Burke, for your remarks on the legality of Trump's militarization of the southern border and its predictability. Next up, we will welcome Dr. Adam Goodman. Dr. Adam Goodman is an assistant professor of history and Latin American and Latino studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. His research focuses on migration policy and history. He has published several articles, essays, and reviews, both in academic venues such as the Journal of American Ethnic History and popular outlets such as the Washington Post. He coordinates the Global Migration Working Group at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where he serves as the faculty advisor for the Fearless Undocumented Alliance. Please help me in welcoming Adam Goodman.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Guillaume, for moderating, and thank you, Susan, for your help with all the logistics, and Heather, Dr. Williams, all the organizers and participants in the IGL. It's an honor to be here. It's nice to come full circle as well. I participated in EPIIC in 1999-2000, so it's nice to be back. And thank you all for sticking around until the last panel of the symposium. Thank you as well, Dr. Burke, for getting us started. I think this is going to be a really interesting discussion and lots to dig into today, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. My presentation shares some commonalities, I think, and we'll be able to hopefully get into perhaps the legality of the militarization of the border and the use of the military, as well as some of the other policies that have been put forth. But just this week, to start out, I'm looking at the politics of immigration statistics, both today and in the past, and what I think we might call the real crisis at the border, and the way in which, the military perhaps, or the immigration service has been manipulated, I think, perhaps by the media, perhaps by the government, or both. But just this week, the Trump administration announced that Border Patrol officials apprehended some 76,000 people in February. Right? This is the highest monthly figure in more than a decade. We face a crisis, a real serious and sustained crisis at our borders, Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen explained to a Senate committee on Wednesday. And indeed, there is a real serious and sustained crisis at the U.S.-Mexico border. But it's a crisis that I think we might say is of the administration's own making. And now, I should note that this is not a partisan critique or argument. I think both the Democrats and the Republicans have helped to create this crisis over time. And I'd like to discuss that as well, perhaps. Starting Bill Clinton, especially in the 1990s, who really started the militarization and fortification of the border. George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump as well. But let's take a few minutes to break down and understand how the administration just this past week has manufactured a crisis of sorts using these statistics at the border in hopes of convincing the public, perhaps, or Congress, that a national emergency does in fact exist. And some of this has already been stated in the previous presentation as well, but the rhetoric here matters a great deal, right? In terms of how to manufacture a crisis at the border. And perhaps the first thing is repeatedly describing migrants and refugees as criminals, rapists, gang members, animals, potential terrorists, thieves and murderers, snakes, illegals, people from shithole countries, these are quotes, who pose existential threats to the security of the United States and Europe, and publicizing this widely in speeches, press releases, and on social media. Generating fear here to support policies is a key goal. Deploying 5,600 troops to the U.S.-Mexico border in South Texas, right, declared to stop the migrant caravan of asylum seekers arriving at the border. And I'd be curious, I don't know if Dr. Burke will be able to go into any details, but even members of the audience to get more opinions about this, and perhaps if you even know people that were deployed, what their opinions were on that particular job assignment. Refusing to admit asylum seekers at ports of entry, right? And this is a question where I think we can wonder whether this is in fact legal, and the ACLU and others have already challenged it in courts, and it will be interesting to see how that plays out. But refusing to admit asylum seekers at ports of entry, which forces people who are seeking refuge to remain in northern Mexico, oftentimes in precarious conditions, and perhaps cross the border without authorization. Right? A lot of those 76,000 people, according to administration officials, would fall into that category of asylum seekers, families seeking asylum, who are counted in that larger statistic. Including asylum seekers, that you forced to cross the border without authorization in the statistics, as I mentioned, of quote-unquote illegal immigrants, right? To create a notion of a surge or invasion of the border for very concrete ends, right? Releasing these inflated statistics that mainstream media outlets will then in turn pick up, helping to circulate and reinforce the desired political narrative. In some cases, I think the Washington Post was particularly bad on this point, not really questioning these statistics, just taking them at face value. The New York Times offered a slightly more nuanced report, and the administration subsequently, I think, mischaracterized that very report in inflammatory email blasts. They were kind of citing the New York Times, amongst others, and quoting these inflated statistics for very purposeful ends. Again, to create this idea of the crisis at the border. These are just a couple of emails received from the past week that the administration sent out. You know, sending administration officials to reinforce this same narrative in front of Congress and to the American public and beyond in televised hearings, and using all of the above that I just mentioned as justification for executive action, whether it's to build a wall, put more agents on the line, increase enforcement spending, expand the nation's capacity to detain and deport immigrants. And these are all things that, you know, perhaps some legal, perhaps some not, but I think here the question of should actually matters a great deal. You know, should we be doing this? Does it make sense to be doing this? And that's perhaps something that we can talk about as well. Now, in a way, you know, this isn't that new. I mean, this is a point I want to emphasize today. It's not just the Trump administration. And this is really taking a page out of a very old playbook in which, you know, border enforcement policies and increased apprehension statistics serve the Department of Homeland Security or the immigration bureaucracy's ends and interests. Right? Immigration officials have long used rising numbers of apprehensions and deportations to simultaneously celebrate accomplishments as well as call attention to the need for additional funding. And this is a tried and true strategy. You know, a former statistician for the immigration bureaucracy in the 1970s said, and I'm quoting here, so the pressure from the top people in the administration is extreme. He also described the media as, quote, one of our best tools in emphasizing the threat that the illegals pose to the stability of the economy, end quote. And as sociologist Gilberto Cárdenas observed at the time, shortly thereafter, you know, authorities have relied on statistics and long have done so to create, quote, a sense of alarm, urgency, a call for action that the media then in turn amplifies. And I think the reality is a little bit different, and that's something that's important to take into consideration. Right? The border has never been so, quote unquote, secure. Right? There already are 650 to 700 miles of barrier along the US-Mexico border. It's not as if it's an open border by any means. The number of agents patrolling that border are at an all-time high. You know, just 15, 20 years ago, there were maybe 2,000 agents roughly on the border. Today, there are 21,000 Border Patrol agents. Right? Net migration from Mexico is down, in fact, at net zero. You know, none of the Congress people from the 9 districts that line the U.S.-Mexico border voted to sustain the president's national emergency declaration. Not a single one of the Congress people from those 9 districts along the border, I think, is an important point. And just within the last few weeks, Air Force General Terrence O'Shaughnessy, the top U.S. General for Homeland Defense, testified before the Senate that he sees no military threat coming from the U.S.-Mexico border, describing the situation as a, quote, national issue rather than an emergency. He called it a national issue as opposed to an emergency. To pay for the new construction, and this is something that I just read this morning, but to pay for the new construction along the border, both that Congress has approved and the president's hoping to do through the National Emergency Declaration, the Pentagon announced that $1 billion will come from military pay and pension accounts. And the Trump National Emergency Declaration would tap another $3.6 billion in military construction project spending. Now, the administration is downplaying all along, or excusing, or perhaps altogether ignoring, what I think we might say is the real crisis at the border. And that's one that the immigration policies of the United States over decades has contributed to and created. Thousands of separated families, thousands of children who suffered sexual abuse in immigration custody, thousands of detained people held in inhumane conditions for extended periods of time, again, under both Democratic and Republican administrations. As many as 180 people or more have died in immigration detention since 2003. I think all these stats and figures raise questions about why is the system the way it is? Right? Who pushes this agenda? Right? Who benefits from the deportation machine? Certainly the administration, we could say, has its own ideological interests and ends in mind, whether that's re-election or otherwise. The bureaucratic self-interest I mentioned of the immigration bureaucracy as well. The media, page clicks, readers, certainly matters. Private companies, prison companies like the Geo Group, Core Civic, which is two of the largest private detention companies in the United States as well as abroad. And I've also uncovered in the process of researching my book examples from the past, from the 1950s, transportation companies that played a similar role in shaping immigration policy. Now, I should point out that this slide, if anyone's a careful observer, if you've seen this photo before, this gets to the bipartisan point. This looks like perhaps a picture we've seen in recent months, but in fact it's from 2014 during the Obama administration. Similar things happening at that point in time. And perhaps the last interested party are certainly employers who are interested in cheap labor, consumers who might want to pay bottom dollar for products as well. So to close, what are the takeaways and things that I think kind of the politics, immigration statistics, and the history tells us? One thing that I've seen throughout my research in the past decade is there's a lot of continuity, in fact, right, across administrations. Right? Prevention through deterrence strategies, of which family separation most recently has been one, the militarization of the border, another starting in the 1990s, and previous examples as well. They have not stopped migration. They have not stopped asylum seekers from coming to the United States. So if we're seriously interested in controlling migration or creating more humane ways for people to come to this country, we should come up with new solutions, and perhaps others on this panel or in the audience have ideas for that. Policies have, over time, exacted, both in the moment and as well as cumulative, physical, psychological, and material harm on migrants and refugees, adults, children, and families. And I think there's a neat and imprecise, perhaps inaccurate, division that happens when a lot of the policy declarations are made, or the rhetoric that's used that divides migrants and American citizens into two neat groups, when in fact oftentimes they're mixed. Many families might include people who are U.S. citizens, permanent residents, people who are here without status, and I think that should be taken into account. And I think there might be some common sense policy solutions, which I hope we'll be able to discuss during the question and answer period as well. So I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adam Goodman, for your thorough analysis of the securitization of the immigration rhetoric, both in this administration and in previous administrations. Now, I would like to welcome another EPIIC alumni, Kerri Talbot. Kerri Talbot is the Director of Federal Advocacy for the Immigration Hub. She works with nonprofit organizations and Congress on policy and legislative advocacy to promote fair treatment of immigrants and refugees. She also previously served as Chief Counsel for U.S. Senator Robert Melendez of New Jersey. She staffed the senator on the Gang of Eight and assisted in writing the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Bill, which passed the Senate in 2013. Please help me in welcoming Kerri Talbot.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to Dr. Williams and to Heather for having me. I was here in 1995 and 1996, really dating myself here, but I'm very happy to be back. So as everyone knows, under international law, asylum seekers and refugees do have significant rights, including the right not to be sent back to a country to where they would be persecuted, the right not to be punished for illegally entering countries and then seeking asylum, among many other rights. Despite this focus in international law on the rights of asylum seekers and refugees, U.S. law and policy under both Obama and Trump administration and many administrations before that has focused primarily on security. I would argue that the world's failure and the current U.S. failure to prioritize the right to asylum and refugee resettlement, it's a failure to recognize the importance of human rights, but it's also a failure to recognize common sense solutions and the multidimensional aspects of the problems facing the U.S. and the issue of migration to the U.S. I'm going to discuss the treatment of Central American refugees by the United States, both under Obama and Trump, and the current focus on securitization rather than an integrated approach that reflects the humanitarian dimensions of the situation at our southern border. As folks have already mentioned, there is a spike in the number of asylum seekers and refugees fleeing violence and persecution in Central America. The number of asylum seekers and refugees has increased dramatically in the last few years. In 2017 alone, the number of refugees from that region grew by 58%. Those being displaced from Central America are largely seeking shelter from rampant gang violence in one of the most murderous regions in the world. Central America is home to four of the world's 50 most deadliest cities. Most Central Americans arriving at the U.S. border are seeking protection. They're presenting themselves to border agents and requesting asylum, as is their right under international law. So despite this Trump administration complaining that folks are arriving illegally and posing a huge security threat, they're actually just pursuing policies that have been in place for decades for asylum seekers to request protection at the U.S. border. Of course, some are entering illegally between ports of entry, often because they're not accommodated at ports of entry. They're told to come back later, or they can't be seen, and then they're pushed to other areas, often much more dangerous and posing more issues for Border Patrol. Unlike refugees, though, asylum seekers are not vetted in advance. They turn themselves in for interviews. They're often held in jail-like settings, detention, while waiting for their proceedings to go forward. In the U.S., this situation of refugees and other migrants arriving at the U.S. border has sparked quite the national conversation. Rising numbers of migrants, even during the Obama administration in 2014, pictures of overcrowded border stations like we just saw a few minutes ago, drove debate even during that administration in 2014 about how to address the situation of asylum seekers from Central America and other migrants from Central America. At that time, the Obama administration implemented security-oriented approaches as well, and really didn't actually pursue humanitarian solutions. Obama had previously, when migration from Central America was lower, had actually closed family detention jails or family detention centers. The Hutto facility, for instance, was closed under Obama. But then in 2014, with the spike in arrivals from Central America, they ended up reopening family detention centers in Texas. They also explored the concept of more refugee camp-like settings. They looked at reception centers that would quickly process people and then release them. They looked at a lot of different solutions, but ultimately really mostly just pursued the family detention center as the means to sort of evaluate cases. But because there are limits to how long you can hold children under U.S. law, the family detention centers couldn't hold children for more than about 20 days. So they ended up using the detention centers as sort of short-term processing facilities where they would do the interviews to determine if an individual had a credible fear of persecution and could go forward with their asylum case in the U.S. The Trump administration has also pursued the use of family detention, but they have litigated these requirements about children being held only for up to 20 days. However, they have not been successful in the courts and have complained frequently about how they've been prevented from holding people for longer periods in jail-like settings. Given that they haven't been able to pursue their policy of mass detention of Central Americans, They've pursued several other policies. Everyone will probably remember in the summer, the family separation policy was another iteration of Trump's attempt to deter migrants from Central America. Unfortunately, I would note that migrants are usually very unaware of what's going to happen to them once they reach the United States. A deterrence theory, in my view, has not at all been successful. Most of these migrants are coming from very remote, often very poor villages in Honduras, Guatemala. They are not aware of what's going to happen, generally speaking, when they arrive in the United States. And so this family separation policy obviously has not been successful at deterring anyone, and obviously led to huge concern about the humanitarian impact of separating children from their parents. Of course, also, they didn't have appropriate tracking mechanisms to reunite kids with their parents, and lots of other abuses occurred during the summer. This policy, as I think most folks know, was blocked quickly in the courts. Next, the Trump administration tried yet another policy aimed at securing the border. They attempted to block all asylum seekers entering between ports. This effort was very quickly shut down by the courts within, I think, like 24 hours. It's clearly against domestic law and international laws. There were no sufficient safeguards to ensure that people wouldn't be sent back to countries where they would be persecuted. The Trump administration is essentially being told by the U.S. legal system that they need to pursue a more balanced approach rather than just a security-oriented approach. And another example of securitization and treatment of Central American refugees as security threats, both the Obama and Trump administration have pursued conversations with Mexico about externalizing the border and keeping asylum seekers in Mexico. So this year, the Department of Homeland Security has started kind of a brand new or relatively new concept, which is to essentially require asylum seekers to return to Mexico and wait for their immigration court hearings. This is called the Migration Protection Protocols. And under this, what I'll call the MPP, individuals who arrive at ports of entry can be asked to remain for months and months in Mexico. Fortunately, the Mexican government is providing humanitarian visas, but the U.S. government is not doing anything to ensure that these migrants are safe or that they don't face persecution in Mexico. And I would argue they have not created sufficient safeguards to ensure that people aren't going to be harmed in Mexico. So this is also the subject of litigation. There's not yet an injunction, but I do suspect there may be soon an injunction against this program as well, just because I don't think there are sufficient safeguards to ensure that they're complying with U.S. law to protect asylum seekers, among other reasons. Although the government argues that the law allows them to place individuals who arrive from a contiguous territory, that would be Mexico, into the immigration court and return them to a country to await the hearing, groups such as mine, civil rights and human rights groups have said, this shouldn't have been applied to asylum seekers, but only to other migrants. I would argue the policy violates international law. So those are just a couple examples of how both the Obama and the Trump administration have focused largely on securitization. Tactics such as these, like family detention, separation from families, prosecution of asylum seekers, forcing people to wait in another country, these are basically all policies to deter migration. This leaves people fleeing persecution essentially with nowhere to go. So after just noting this trend in the US towards securitization, I wanted to make a few recommendations about how I think asylum seekers should be dealt with. Obviously, we should be respecting the principles of international law not to return people to countries where they face a threat. We shouldn't be interfering with the right to seek asylum. People should be able to make asylum claims and see them through to the end in the country where they apply for asylum. We should be assessing these claims fairly. So that means that you can't often do it in a day or two. You need often weeks, at least, if not months, to really consider a claim. I don't think we should be jailing asylum seekers, or definitely not children. We should be pursuing alternatives to detention, which would be like community monitoring supervision programs to make sure people actually show up for their court hearings and comply with U.S. law, but that they're not they don't need to be in jail to make sure that people will actually show up. I do think we should have much more comprehensive assistance on the humanitarian front, both to international organizations and domestic organizations. I think we should ensure that border policies don't result in excessive use of force or put migrants' lives in danger. The use of tear gas, I think, was beyond what we should be doing at the border. I don't, however, personally have a huge issue with the military providing some support services at the border. I don't think that's one of the big issues here in terms of human rights issues. I think we should be doing more to resettle refugees. We should reinstitute programs in Central America that allow people who have families in the U.S. to go ahead and apply to be refugees into the U.S. We should also just make sure at the border that we have humane services when people arrive. We've had several deaths recently of children. There's a huge outbreak of chickenpox and mumps in the family detention centers. We have not been treating it as a humanitarian problem. We've been treating it as what it used to be, which was the adult males coming to work. Now we have small children, infants, who are much more likely to be susceptible to diseases or to die when they're exposed to diseases. We haven't really adjusted our equipment, our supplies, our personnel at the borders to make sure that we can deal with those humanitarian issues. So basically, I would just urge that we really treat this more as the humanitarian issue that it is, that we provide these kind of humanitarian reception centers, that we evaluate people's cases, that we monitor them and ensure that they do show up for their hearings. I don't have any issue with having a border that has border security, that has border agents, that requests people come to ports of entry. I really don't have any issue with any of that, but I just think we're also missing the other aspect of the problem, which is that it is actually right now primarily a humanitarian issue and a refugee flow. So clearly, I think the Trump focus on securitization and deterrence has not worked because we just saw this month that we have the highest number in 10 years. So clearly, his approach of primarily or almost only focusing on security is not actually solving the problem. So I would urge us to look at a more comprehensive approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Talbot, for your remarks on the treatment of Central American migrants at the Mexican border. I will now present Dr. Monika Wohlfeld. Dr. Monika Wohlfeld is the holder of the German Chair in Peace and Conflict Prevention and Lecturer in Security Studies at the University of Malta. Previously, she was the Deputy Director of the Conflict Prevention Center of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, as well as the Head of External Cooperation for the OSCE. In these positions, Dr. Wohlfeld was responsible for the OSCE's Mediterranean Dialogue. She has published widely on matters related to European security, regional cooperation, crisis management, and the Mediterranean. Please help me in welcoming Monika Wohlfeld.
Thank you, Chairman. I am a security expert, and I want to look at this from the perspective of a security expert. I'm also a migrant, and I have experience of regular migration, but also irregular migration during the Cold War when my family moved to Germany. And so for me, this is more than just a theoretical issue. But let me start by saying that I'm old enough to remember the debate at the end of the Cold War that sought to enlarge the concept of security to cover issues such as organized crime or later also of terrorism. But most recently, I've been actually quite stunned to hear migration cited together with organized crime and terrorism as a major security threat. So this debate sort of came around to the point where, although I was part of the debates pushing for an enlargement of the concept of security, now it's come to a point where I'm not comfortable with it. And I will say a few words about why. The first observation would be that I think it's wrong to speak about migration overall in this context. We would need to employ a much more nuanced approach to that, because migration is an opportunity, and historically has been seen as an opportunity. It has sometimes been seen also as a threat, that's true. But overall, it's interesting how when it's emigration, then it's seen as an opportunity, and when it's immigration, then it's seen as a threat. The process of consolidating of fixed frontiers and policed by state authorities has led to a bit of a different understanding about what migration does to our understanding of security. Now, states are, of course, entitled to control movement across the borders, and states use migration control measures to demonstrate the sovereign control of a territory and to address public concerns that their sovereignty is being undermined. So it is a tool to respond to migration. Of course, these entitlements are restricted by specific provisions of international law and human rights obligations. I don't think I need to repeat that. It's already been stated. And I would say that to say migration as a security issue would be wrong. Now, what type then, or which aspect of migration might be pursued, might be understood as a security issue? It would have to be what we would call irregular migration. And even then, I think we'd have to continue to look at in which situations. So, for example, if it's mass migration, or if it comes at a point in time when there are deep economic problems in the country of destination. But I cannot see how saying that migration is a security threat helps us in any way to understand the phenomenon. Number of irregular migrants globally has been growing. That's a result of increased mobility, as a result of globalization. Also increasing limitations of legal migration possibilities as governments respond by restrictions. And then there's the substantial mismatch between the supply and demand sides of labor globally. And then, of course, you have migration, irregular migration, that stems from mass infringements on human rights and conflicts such as we have seen in Syria, Libya, Iraq, or the Middle East. Another question I think that we need to pose is, whose security should we be concerned about? So the first question is, states or humans? Should we be concerned about national security or human security? The public debate on the migration security nexus today focuses more on issues related to national security. But the issue is here, of course, that we have another way of looking at it, and it is to focus on human security. And that gives us a very different perception of what this issue is about. And I think it links neatly to what Kerri said about humanitarian aspects of migration. Now, I mentioned how migration has been linked to organized crime and terrorism. It's a nuanced relationship that needs to be explored. It cannot be dismissed, but I think it's a very nuanced situation and it needs to be dealt with by looking at the various ways that they may relate to each other. And I think that most authors will argue that the link is overestimated, that the actual links are limited. Now, when we move to a human security perspective, what we get is that we move away from a perspective on border management challenges And we move to an alternative approach that places the migrant as the referent object of threats. So what we would be looking at then is the structural violence that causes many to migrate, the impact of deportation, detention policies, the hazards to personal safety of migrants resulting from the increased reluctance of states to offer sanctuary to those in need. And those are just some of the aspects that then emerged as key issues. So from the human security perspective, the main imperative would be not to curb migration by all possible means, but rather to, for example, prevent the loss of life, protect migrants against human smugglers, ensure the rights of genuine refugees. Now, since we are defining migration as a national security issue that has consequences for the kind of policies that are used to counter the threat, that would be greater surveillance, detention, deportation, and overall more restrictive policies. And this, in turn, has an impact on the human security of migrants. So that encourages them to use more dangerous routes, using migrant smugglers, human traffickers. It limits the possibilities of reaching access to safe countries. But it also encourages anti-immigrant tendencies and opinions in the publics. And that, in turn, has also an impact on the human security of migrants, for example, in the countries of destination. So an argument that I would pose is that human security threats to irregular migrants by far outweigh the national security threats that they may create. The two approaches, so national security and human security, are often seen as standing in tension to each other, being incompatible, but they are not necessarily incompatible. They properly crafted national security policies can further human security. A human security approach moves migration discussion beyond the sort of narrow preoccupation with border control issues and opens it to a debate on conditions of insecurity that drive irregular migration. And human security would also allow us to ask whether policies developed out of this misguided view of national security put people in less secure positions, for example, placing them in the hands of traffickers and smugglers. Now, another question that I would like to pose here is security of which states? Which states' security should we be concerned about? The debate on migration is largely focused on the countries of destination. So mostly developed countries, although, of course, there is a great deal of south-to-south migration. I know that this was already discussed, but the debate when we talk about securitization of migration, we're talking about the United States, we're talking about EU countries. But that's obviously not correct. First of all, because the majority of migration and irregular migration as well doesn't take place in that direction. Secondly, because irregular migration, or migration management presents a far greater challenge to weak states rather than to developed states. So the less developed states' perspectives are largely disregarded. But they have their own concerns about irregular migration. For example, disregard for human rights and labor rights of irregular migrants, the impact of the trafficking industries, brain drain that may be an effect of such migration. But then also the issue of remittances, of the monies that are being paid into the economies of the countries of origin. And then that type of migration can also be a security valve for countries that, say, has growing numbers of young people without a perspective in their own country so they can pursue a future elsewhere. So there's less danger of a social explosion in the countries of origin. And all of these perspectives are often overlooked in the debates on securitization of migration. And so we need broader policies aimed at addressing the security migrations nexus that will reconcile the positions of developed countries of destination and developing countries of destination, transit, and origin, because that's what they are. Let me say a few words about the Mediterranean. I'm based in Malta, and I've been watching the so-called migration crisis for the last 10 years since I came to Malta. The Mediterranean is now considered one of the most important gateways through which irregular migrants seek to reach the European Union. There has been an increase of numbers of irregular migrants for a considerable period of time before 2015, the year where the so-called migration crisis took place. I cannot really present the entire situation and also the EU's responses to it in great detail, but let me focus on one aspect, and it is the fact that there's quite a number of people who are drowning in the process of trying to reach the European Union. And so how does the European Union deal with this aspect of saving lives in the Mediterranean Sea? The response initially has been really to focus on that aspect. But in the meantime, there's been a change of a policy in that the priority has been now to address the smuggling networks. And while the overall numbers have been dropping, the percentages of people who drown in the Mediterranean have been going up. So in terms of numbers, they lower, but that's because the overall numbers are lower. The migratory pressure hasn't lessened, but rather it was the EU activities and operations in the Mediterranean that have resulted in the lower numbers of migrants. The big change in terms of the Central European route has been that the Libyan Coast Guard has now been empowered to address boats, people who required rescue in its territorial waters, and it's being trained to this effect by the European Union. Human rights issues are not the priority in that effort. There was also a curtailment of NGO rescue operations in the Mediterranean. Currently, there are no NGO boats working in rescuing migrants in the Mediterranean. And some also say, therefore, there are no witnesses to what is happening there. The disembarkation of rescued migrants in the EU countries is now based on ad hoc arrangements. The boats used by smugglers are destroyed so that they are not reused. Smugglers increasingly use smaller and more dangerous boats or inflatables. And NGOs now say that these boats become an emergency already when they leave the shore, which is when the Libyan Coast Guard becomes involved. And so overall, the rates, the percentages of people who drown in the Mediterranean has not gone down, which I think raises quite a number of issues as to priorities. The public opinion and the changing political landscape in a number of EU member countries in which right-wing forces or populist forces became stronger in the last number of years are likely to further impact on changing the balance of national security and human security approaches towards irregular migration. But the securitization of migration, especially of irregular migration, poses significant consequences and hidden costs and creates a vicious cycle of supply and demand for security. Such processes then serve short-term needs, but arguably not the long-term interest of the developed country of destination with respect to the preservation of human rights and liberal values. And so I would advocate bringing in a human security perspective when addressing securitization of migration. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your remarks on the need to find a human security approach to migration. Thank you to all panelists for the insightful opening remarks. We will now like to open the floor to questions from the audience. There's a microphone in each aisle, and we ask that you line up behind them. Please introduce yourself before asking your question. In the interest of time, please direct your question to one panelist and keep your questions under 1 minute.
Hello, my name is Zach. I'm a member of this year's EPIIC class, and I have a question directed to Dr. Burke. Ms. Talbot mentioned that actions taken by both the military and other law enforcement agencies at the southern border during both this administration and previous administrations are violations of international law. I'm just curious if you disagree, agree, or have another opinion on the matter.
Thanks for the question, Zach. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So, Zach, thanks for the question. I got to tell you, though, it's not a matter of what I think or what I agree with in my opinion. I'll tell you what the law states. It's as long as the U.S. military is operating in domestic capacity inside the walls. I'm sorry, I didn't mean for that slip. Inside of the borders of this country, then they are subjected to the laws of this country. So it's everything I've laid out. As far as international law, they're not subjected to international law while they're operating in the U.S. homeland.
Thanks.
Thanks for the question. Yep.
Hi, my name is Nikki Maddie. I'm a proud member of this year's EPIIC Colloquium, and I have a question for Ms. Talbot. So you expressed your support for a secured border with regularized entry at ports, and even said that you had no issue with military support at the border. However, I really wonder when that support may transition into suppression and become a threat to migrant security. Therefore, I'm wondering how we can balance your call for humanitarian services at the border with the president's call for military force.
Yeah, and I guess just to also clarify on the previous question, I didn't actually say that I think the military is engaged in international legal violations. I think the military that's there now is just providing support services to Border Patrol. And I think what's going on is that there are other policies related to asylum seekers. Those are definitely violating international law and have been found to violate domestic law. Those don't involve the military per se. Those involve Trump administration policies about turning back asylum seekers. So I think as long as the military is involved in just regular border control, and I think there's no issue with that. I think the issue is where our policies start to trample on the rights of asylum seekers under domestic and international law in terms of turning people back without considering their claims. I mean, I'll also mention that obviously there are people arriving at the border, southern border, who don't have valid asylum claims, but we think that they should all be processed in a regular fashion. There should be humanitarian reception for those who need it. There should be evaluation of their asylum claims, et cetera. But thanks.
I'm Gabe. I'm a member of this year's EPIIC class, and I have a question for Dr. Goodman. So you showed compelling evidence that the supposed crisis on the border has been somewhat manufactured by the current administration. So I was just hoping to have you elaborate a little bit more, because I'm a little lost on who serves to benefit from a manufactured migration crisis, whether that be the administration or any other parties beyond the administration that would be invested in something other than re-election. I know that administrations that can prove that they've kept the country safe in a crisis often poll well. So if there's any motivations beyond that or by other entities, I would love to hear about that.
Thank you. Thanks for that question. I think certainly individual politicians as you bring up, and as I mentioned briefly as well, might politicize immigration statistics for particular ends. And I think in turn that, could also benefit a whole number of interest groups, whether it's the Immigration Service itself, as I mentioned, the media, private companies that might be involved or invested in immigration detention and deportation, their shareholders as well. I mean, the stock prices of, Core Civic and Geo Group, I think, went up 30 or 40% the day after the election. People, were placing their bets, so to speak. And, I think that in a sense, it goes far beyond, as you bring up, and I totally agree, the individual, whether it's the president or a particular administration official that happens to be promoting that policy. And as I also mentioned, it's been a bipartisan effort, as we've seen over the course of time. So it's not one particular party, it's not one particular politician, but a whole number of people that benefit from and have promoted and maintained and sustained, and I think it's likely that it'll continue after this administration and this president are out of office, whenever that might be.
Hi, my name is Connor. I'm a sophomore in this year's EPIIC class, and my question is directed at Ms. Talbot. You mentioned in the previous question answering Nikki that some asylum claims at the border are unfounded, and recent federal data showed that asylum claims at the border have increased 2,000% in the last 10 years to 97,000 approximately a year. Is it feasible, in your opinion, to house all of these people humanely in detention centers? And if not, how do you ensure that the system is not abused and everyone attends asylum hearings?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I definitely don't think it's feasible to hold all asylum seekers in detention centers. It costs between $200 and up to $350 a day. So people, I think, in America would be amazed at how much it's costing, much more than the Holiday Inn or even the Hyatt or the DoubleTree, to house each individual asylum seeker in detention or jail. And so that's clearly not feasible to hold that many people. And so I think the best approach would be if we could have an alternatives to detention program that would provide monitoring services, information about the court processes, their legal obligations under U.S. law, explain where they're supposed to show up and when, how to comply, et cetera. And when we have done that program on a pilot basis through the U.S. government, the compliance rate was literally 100%. However, it was just a small pilot and didn't get to keep going as the Trump administration shut it down. So we would like to explore that kind of program again, because I mean, my experience and belief is that when people have a better orientation as to what they're supposed to do, they will generally comply with U.S. law.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Patrick Billiard. I'm also a member of this year's EPIIC class. I'm a sophomore here at Tufts. And my question is actually directed to Dr. Burke and Ms. Talbot as well. And it kind of has to do more or less with what you just talked about, but sort of budget apportioning. So as you know, as every other government, the U.S. also has a fixed budget of like a limited amount of resources that they can use specifically for immigration purposes. And my question is, considering that, I mean, the military is already there, kind of like for security purposes in the border. Do you think that having sort of thousands of troops there down in the border is the most efficient way of dealing with migration? And then I guess the question would be that should that be the priority as far as the U.S. budget, considering that you have sort of limited resources? Shouldn't it go more towards, like the actual quality of the detention centers or to the judicial system that has to process so many asylum claims? And sort of like if that shouldn't be the priority of the military being there, then what should it be?
You want to take it first?
Yeah, sure. I'm glad you asked that question, because I did want to clarify that while I don't think the human rights abuses are occurring because the military is there, or that the military being there is a human rights abuse per se, I don't think it's a great use of resources to spend all that money to have the military down there when we do have very high levels of Border Patrol right now in the budget and huge increases in DHS spending over the last couple years. And what I also say, we see it very clearly in all the appropriations talks. Like, for example, we're putting money into the wall when we didn't get a Coast Guard cutter in Alaska that we need for actual security threats dealing with Russia, China, et cetera. And so there are real trade-offs to just focusing on what is actually more of a humanitarian issue on the southern border versus actual national security threats.
As far as the military piece of that is concerned with the budgeting, it's really interesting, at least to me anyway. I wrote a piece for The Hill back in December, and one of the things that I actually talked about was this specific issue. And my argument in that article was that if we don't fund the wall, again, it wasn't an endorsement to fund the wall or not. It basically was just, again, putting out the facts, saying that if we don't fund the wall at the initial $5 billion request that the administration had made at the time, then I laid out the numbers, and the facts were pretty clear that you could easily make a case that the military deployment and with an expanded troop presence down on the border would go within about 24 to 25 months would actually exceed that $5 billion cap in terms of all the troops they were going to put down there. And then some of the past rhetoric that the administration had laid out, saying that they were not only going to do some things on the border, but they were going to expand troop presence and expand troop deployments, lengthen them, and so forth. I made a couple of predictions, and frankly, they came out to be pretty accurate. So it's, again, whether or not, there's a lot of things that the military can do, that the administration can do to move some money from one pot to the other. Talk about the color of money and how they spend some things. That's not for me to get into. I just simply can't. But it certainly raises the question as to whether or not we could spend this money elsewhere and what we actually gain from it. So thanks for the question.
Can I ask a quick follow-up?
Yeah.
And again, I understand you might not be able to answer, but I mean, the timing here seemed to be really important with the deployment, with the midterm elections, and talking about the ways in which military might or might not be manipulated. But it didn't seem coincidental that it happened right in the lead up to the elections.
Yep. Definitely not coincidental in that respect. This is, again, part of some of my contentions that I've been making in these pieces that I've written, is that the Trump administration, I think that they're certainly trying to advance their agendas, and I think they're using the military as a political pawn in that respect. And that's why that was my final piece when I was making my remarks, is that I think that the military should be above the politicization fray. I don't think that, again, there's a lot of research out there that suggests that the military is the most trusted institution and of all the federal agencies and departments, and I'd like to see it stay that way, frankly, exposing my own biases here, but again, I think it should be above that. So, yeah.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming to our symposium. I'm a sophomore here at Tufts, and my question is directed at Dr. Wohlfeld. You addressed the human element in migration, and we've seen the EU externalize their borders, whether it be in Morocco, Turkey, and Libya, and I specifically want to focus on Libya, and you brought up the Libyan Coast Guard. Yesterday morning, I believe, in our human trafficking and slavery panel, one of the panelists brought up the point that a lot of these Libyan Coast Guard members are part of the issue with human trafficking and slavery, where they'll intercept these boats destined for Italy or other Central European countries and take them back and put them into the slave trade. And I was wondering, especially with a lot of the EU's criticism of Hungary for their barbaric use of constructing a border wall, if you could address some of the hypocrisy of the EU, especially when it regards human security. Thank you.
Yes. Mr. Tinti, right, spoke about this on the use of an anti-smuggling operation to really make sure that the numbers of migrants are limited in the Mediterranean. Well, the situation in Libya is obviously a very complex one, and the European Union was struggling how to deal with Libya and some other states which are countries of origin or transit. And it has decided to interact with states with which in the past it would have not really considered as safe states for migrants. The EU-Turkey agreement has, for example, foreseen that Turkey will be now considered a country, safe country, so country to which you can send back migrants. With Libya, that is not the case. However, in the Libyan territorial waters, the Libyan Coast Guard, which is supported by the EU, is in charge of bringing people back, and because it's linked to militias, and some say that it's also linked to the smuggling networks. This raises human rights issues, that's quite clear. Generally, what happens is that there is less attention paid to the situation of migrants before they actually arrive in Europe, whether that's the fairly dramatic situations on their journeys through deserts, through borders, through countries that are difficult to cross for them. That has been really less consideration, less attention paid to that after the so-called migration crisis. And so that gives the impression that the priority is to limit the numbers of new arrivals. And the numbers have been fairly clear. There's been a considerable drop of arrivals in 2018. It went back to, I think, 4 years ago, or 4 years before. And so that has the desired effect, but it does raise a number of issues about the EU commitment to human rights and fair treatment of asylum seekers and refugees, certainly.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, thank you everyone for being here. My name is Talbot. I'm a sophomore here at Tufts University. I also have a question for Dr. Wohlfeld. So you mentioned, I want to talk more about the future of European politics. So I'm personally a huge believer of countries taking more refugees, but it can also, but in the reality it can be harder to achieve that. It can be argued that Europe was not ready for taking in so many refugees, asylum seekers like back in 2015, and migration crisis has had a consequential impact on European politics. In Germany, for example, we've seen the rise of AfD, the radical right, and Chancellor Merkel won last year's election, which is a much less percentage than she did last time. And then she is going out after this term, and the radical right is becoming stronger and stronger. What do you think is the future of the European political landscape going to look like? And what should the European Union do right now to effectively address the migration crisis while also combating the growing influence of the radical right?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's been two arguments advanced in favor of making sure that the numbers of migrants are fewer. The one is the argument about the support for populist parties in a number of EU member states that thrive on this migration agenda, on this migration debate, and therefore also a shift of the political spectrum a bit more to the right in a number of countries. But the second issue that has been put forward was also the future of the European Union. Within the EU, there are big divisions between the North and the South, and the West and the East on the issue of migration. So that certainly plays a big role. And then, of course, there's this emergence of the populist parties, which will have an effect on how the EU will develop and how it will be conceptualized. So, these are two aspects that have been put forward in the debate. And I read most recently an article in British newspaper, basically saying that this migration crisis, so-called migration crisis, will be the end of the EU, which I think is basically Brits gloating on EU difficulties when, in fact, dealing with their own Brexit situation. So it does play a role in the European political discourse, and it will continue to do so because the migratory pressures have not gone away. So there is a situation where we have fewer arrivals, but that's not because fewer people decide to embark on the journey. And so these issues will come. But now we have political unrest in Algeria, and that might have consequences. I'm sure that there are nervous people in a number of European capitals, one in particular, who watch the situation in Algeria and the possible migratory flows that might emerge from that. There's lots of developments that need to be watched. And there are European Parliament elections in May that will show in how far that populist agenda was able to advance in EU countries.
Thank you.
I'm Gabriel Alobamo. I'm a local student. This is addressed to Dr. Burke. You spoke about how you wanted to kind of like look past the emotion, look at the facts, the possibilities, and the outcomes. I think emotion's all good to look at sometimes, but both approaches are all needed. While the moral issue has sides that don't seem to agree with each other, that it cannot reach a compromise. Do you see there being a implementation compromise? Do you see there being a compromise with implementation? Do you see in the policy or the legal or the military, both parties having some type of agreement on how to actually employ this policy?
Are you asking if I see the military coming to an agreement, like basically negotiating with the Trump administration as to how they should be employed in the U.S.?
More just, do you see in the parties in the U.S. having reached an agreement on how to actually implement these policies, whether on the military level, the legal level, or the policy level, even if they don't agree on the moral backing behind these things?
It's anybody's guess as to whether or not these policies and laws will be changed. Again, I ended my comments by stating that we have right now the current national security architecture, the way that it is, the way that it's written, is dated. Frankly, it's dated. Most of the things that we have are laws that were adopted in the 19th century that are still applying to U.S. military operations today. Again, it's up to you as to whether or not you believe those things are appropriate or not, given the modernization of the U.S. military and the landscape that we operate in today. But the fact is that they're dated. And we need to understand that the military is not a political organization, right? The military is part of the U.S. government, a structure or an organization within the U.S. government. They do what they're told to do. There's an idea of objective versus subjective control that Sam Huntington put out back in 1957, which is a great book on civil-military relations if anybody's interested in the subject. And what he basically posits is that the idea of objective control is where the military is a professional organization that will do what they need to do, absent really any guidance or restriction from the federal government. So they are told to go do a job, they go do the job without micromanagement. The fact is, again, I'm trying to keep it pretty clear that I don't believe that the military should be politicized, regardless. The military is not part of this negotiation process. So as far as the elected officials are concerned, that's where I think there could be some progress made. If the narrative is such that this is an unpopular approach, using the military to secure the border, again, make your own opinions and assessments based on what you read and what you consume, but the fact is the military shouldn't be part of that discussion. So they, again, keep coming back to the central point here, they should be above the fray. But as far as negotiations are concerned, it's tough to say, just given the way that our system works. I frankly, if you're asking for an opinion, I don't see a whole lot of progress that will be made, at least on this particular subject. There's a lot of legislative history, specifically on the Insurrection Act, that you can go look up. I've written on that topic as well. There have been changes to that act that have been proposed and put through National Defense Authorization Acts that were then repealed about 2 to 3 years later when administrations have shifted and changed. So there's a lot of stuff that will change, but frankly, I think it all kind of comes back to the center. And I don't think there's going to be a lot of change in how the military operates, at least from a legal and policy standpoint.
Thank you.
So, yep.
Hi, my name is Mrugank, and I'm a second-year student here. And my question is directed to all of the panelists because I think this is a general implicit trend in the Trump administration as well as most of Europe, which is the link between Islam and viewing migrants as a security threat. Because in fact, even in one of the tweets that we saw as part, Donald Trump's tweets that we saw as part of Dr. Goodman's presentation, he mentions how the caravan of migrants from Mexico, I think unnecessarily he mentions how they include criminals and unknown Middle Easterners, which doesn't really make inherent sense. So I wanted to, do you think that there is any link between religion and securitization of borders?
I think that, so the Border Patrol looks at whether people are migrating in an unusual manner. And they have for many administrations, right? So they'll look at, is someone entering even at the JFK airport who's from a country that normally doesn't go through that airport. And so in that way, if someone from Saudi Arabia is showing up at the Tijuana port of entry, they're going to get additional screening. And I don't necessarily have a problem with that. I don't think it should be connected to religion, but I think and sometimes I do think in the past it has been. But I think that, looking at unusual migration flows is totally fine. I do think it was way, way overstated and pretty crazy, their conversation about the caravan, just because it was a relatively small number of people. There weren't, to my knowledge, any Middle Easterners. There were some people who had committed crimes previously who were in U.S. databases who would get additional screening, but it wasn't anything beyond what Border Patrol could normally deal with, and I think it was just obviously totally overblown in terms of any type of threat. But to answer to your question, it's certainly religion should play no role for sure.
I would also jump in and just say that, I think, yes, some people have been singled out for their religious beliefs, perhaps, where they're from as well. And this fits into a much longer history, throughout the history of the United States, over the course of centuries. Particular groups, whether they're racial, ethnic, national groups, religious groups, have been targeted. The Chinese in the late 19th, early 20th century, along with other Asian groups, were the primary targets for exclusion and deportation. Eastern European and Southern European Jews and Catholics as well, have been singled out at different points in the late 19th, early 20th century. Certainly Mexicans, Central Americans, Latinos more recently, as well as Arabs, Muslims, Middle Easterners, or anyone perceived to be a member of one of those groups. So I think that's pretty clear, and that's a consistent through line throughout U.S. history, although who has been targeted or who officials have targeted has changed over time.
Maybe I can just mention that when you look at opinion polls in EU countries, there are countries that have had no Muslim immigrants, or hardly any. But yet, if you ask the population what would be the biggest security threat, they would name exactly that, Muslim immigration, yes. And that is a strange story because those are places where there have been no terrorist attacks so far. But it's all a matter of perception, I suppose, and political discourse and the presence of populist discourse in those countries.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks again for coming out tonight. My name is Madison. I'm in this year's EPIIC class. And some of our readings this year have suggested that securitization of borders and making them stricter can only lead to more irregular migration. And we've learned about the dangers of that, smuggling, which can turn into trafficking. So I'm just wondering how, if you might have some insight into how governments can reconcile that morally, reconcile people's safety with the perceived notion of security.
I would say that, for example, one good example of what you're talking about is on the U.S. border, the number of people that they're processing through the ports of entry is very small in some circumstances. So, for instance, at the San Ysidro port of entry, which is near San Diego, a huge, important gateway into the United States. They're only processing about below 150 people per day. So the problem with that is that obviously the demand is much more, and so people are waiting many weeks to try to get in. They'll end up crossing at much more dangerous places. They'll hire smugglers to take them into much further away, where they're farther away from medical treatment. And so, yeah, it does get much, much more dangerous when you're not allowing people to go to the ports of entry. I find it deeply frustrating that the administration continues to say that they want people to apply at ports of entry, but then they've essentially shut down the ports of entry. And so there is no way for people to for most people to be able to legally ask for protection. But,
Thank you.
Hi. This next question is actually directed to Dr. Wohlfeld. It's more speculative more than anything, because I was just wondering, considering that we've seen sort of an increase in right-wing movements on an international scale, but most importantly in Europe, sort of walking from here on out, do you think, what is the probability of migration continuing to be a securitization issue in comparison to it starting to be treated like a humanitarian issue? Because I guess that the people that are most crafting this narrative right now are kind of at the spotlight of this right wing, be it Le Pen or Orban, and yeah, sort of like seeing that might be the future of European politics for a while. What do you think is probably the way in which people are going to continue to phrase it from here on out?
Well, yes, obviously the presence of right-wing or populist parties in a number of EU states will have an impact on how the discourse on migration will proceed. I mean, to give you an example, there was a meeting of ministers of interior just a couple of days ago, and the hope was that there would be a package, two packages adopted, one dealing with border management issues and one with reform of the common asylum system. The border management package was agreed upon, but not the one aimed at reform of the common asylum system. And this will be probably sold as a big success of the EU, but in fact, I think it is a failure. There were countries led by Hungary, but with a number of others aligning with Hungary that were not in agreement, and even this, singling out a number of reforms that maybe would have been possible and leaving the difficult ones aside. This entire package of issues was not agreed upon. And so when you see which countries are the ones that block progress on some of these issues within the EU, then that tells you also a little bit about the future of how the EU will address migration. But the issue of divisions within the EU, I think, is a really significant one. You have real animosity. You have disagreement on this issue of solidarity when it comes to distribution of asylum seekers within the European Union. You have Central European countries that say, well, Germany caused it, and now we are supposed to pick up after it, right? Which is really an incorrect perception of the situation. So I think it will be one issue to watch, and something that is that will remain on the table of the European Union, because, like I said, the migratory pressures have not disappeared. They are just kept in check right now, but that doesn't mean that this is how it's going to continue.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lomax, and I'm a Tufts student. This question is for Dr. Goodman and Ms. Talbot. Why are people more upset at Trump's deportation procedures when Obama deported the most people of any president ever? Why has the perception changed towards deportation?
Could you repeat the last part of the question? Sorry.
Yeah, why has the perception changed towards deportation?
I mean, one thing is that, you know, at least toward the end of the Obama administration, they had priorities, so they would go after. I didn't totally agree with all of the priorities because they actually included recent border crossers, which I didn't think should be on the list. But in terms of prioritizing other serious criminals, prioritizing serious criminals, that was sort of a way of going after people in a more thoughtful manner. The Trump administration essentially threw those priorities out the window and just will go after absolutely anyone, including people who have disabled children or people who have lived here for 20 years and people who are trying to legalize through their spouse, you know, and so there was just no rhyme or reason really to who they would go after. And so I think that's one thing, obviously. Another thing is just total disregard for asylum, as we've been discussing, has been a huge sort of defining feature of this administration. But I mean, I do take your point that certainly under the Obama administration, there were also very serious concerns as well. But they also didn't, I think it's also partly just the constant rhetoric and the use, just whenever the Russia investigation comes up, suddenly we're again talking about the caravan or the border wall or the military going down there. It's just the constant use of this issue to flame tensions also is clearly a concern.
Yeah, I would add, you know, I think that's right in that, you know, Trump, since launching his candidacy, has also put this issue front and center. And, you know, some of it's obviously partisan, you know, without a doubt. I think some of it's tied to a much larger, broader agenda that goes beyond deportation and the administration's proposals to ban migration from certain countries, many of them majority Muslim. Some of it might be related to efforts to restrict legal and illegal or authorized and unauthorized migration, which the administration has also put forth. And I think a big difference, you know, there's a lot of continuity between Obama and Trump, you know, in terms of the policies, the immigration bureaucracy. But one big change, which ties back to what Ms. Talbot was saying, is that, you know, I think there's been a concerted fear campaign both to drum up support for the administration's agenda, but also to scare migrants and to scare people who are in the country perhaps without authorization into leaving, or in today's parlance we'd say self-deporting. You know, I don't think that that's a mistake. I don't think that's by accident. And that is a big piece of the larger agenda this administration has rolled out and, you know, doubled down on time and again. And that's also something that has a long history. You know, throughout my research, I've seen that there's a few different ways that government officials at local, state, and federal level have tried to force, coerce, and scare people into leaving. And I think in this particular administration, we've seen that one mechanism of migration control has been ramped up compared to the Obama administration.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Okay. Like, do you think it's better for leaders to be like really upfront with their policies and like kind of just like saying what they're going to do, similar to what Trump is? He just like says it, and as opposed to Obama being more like, he wouldn't talk about it as much, and I don't think a lot of people knew about all of his like intense deportation policies. Do you think it's better for a leader to just be like more direct about it, or be more like secretive about it? Because they both did similar things in terms of like the number of people being deported and like a high security at the border.
I'd vote for just honest. I mean, I feel like obviously there's just so much documentation of Trump's lying about the threat or the solutions. And so, I mean, I would also say under Obama that there was definitely an evolution. Like I remember in 2010-ish, 2011, there was, like, he was still deporting Dreamers, basically. And then over time, you know, by 2012, he created the program for Dreamers so that they could stay, and then later created his priorities. So over time, he sort of put into place more safeguards to try to allow people who've lived here for a long time to be able to stay. And so I wouldn't say the beginning of his administration was very different from the end, basically. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
This will be our last question.
Hi, I have a question for Ms. Talbot. A few questions ago, you discussed how the administration's making it difficult for people to come here regularly is a motivating factor behind enhanced or higher levels of irregular migration. So do you think that it is possible for the US to get to a point where we have drastically reduced levels of irregular migration and a drastically more fluid and perhaps sensible regular migration process? And if so, what does that look like?
So I worked on comprehensive immigration reform, and I do hope someday that we can get there again, where we have a national conversation about reforming the immigration laws to allow people who've been here for a long time to regularize their status and be able to live here permanently, and then include security and enforcement mechanisms as well. But I think it may take a while, like at least several years before we get there. I would say, though, that generally speaking, migration at the southern border has decreased substantially in general. We've been at 40-year lows. We are seeing some spikes related to the Central American refugees mostly coming to the U.S. border, but in general, like net migration from Mexico, 0. We don't actually have, in my view, a huge illegal immigration challenge at the southern border, other than this particular population who I think largely has pretty serious human rights, humanitarian issues. So I think I do worry that the issue we're facing with Central America is going to potentially challenge or hopefully not poison comprehensive immigration reform discussions, because I think it's a very particular refugee problem, which does not relate to a lot of the other immigration challenges we need to meet through legislation. So.
Thank you very much.
So please help me in thanking our panelists for participating in today's panel, as well as everyone in the audience for coming out today. So, as this is the last panel of our symposium, I'd like to take a brief moment to conclude our symposium and the past few days. Over the past 3 days, we have participated in intense discussion and debate analyzing the complex facets of global migration. Our first panel on integration, adaptation, and inclusion explored the social, political, and economic barriers migrants encounter in their destination countries. The second panel covered issues relating to slavery in corporate supply chains, why the distinction between smuggling and trafficking is important, and the neo-slavery in migrant labor in the Gulf. Our panel on gender and migration celebrated International Women's Day and concluded that a migration policy guided by a concern for women's advancement ultimately results in a more equitable and peaceful world for all genders. The Defining Refugees in a Changing Climate panel delved into the shortcomings of the criteria for who is a refugee as the world faces new challenges. The Paradox of Sovereignty and Global Migration provided lively debate between the panelists and questions from audience members on what it means for a nation to be sovereign and whether or not migration poses an intrinsic threat to sovereignty. The panel on migration and cities highlighted the varying approaches local governments can take towards building more inclusive communities for migrants. In the South-to-South migration panel, we explored the patterns of South-to-South movement, the drivers of migration like wage disparities and conflicts. We also had the opportunity to hear from 2 keynote speakers, learning about the intricacies of migratory flows and potential solutions from Professor Paul Collier, and about the importance of multilateralism and solidarity when dealing with global issues from His Excellency Miroslav Lajcek. I hope that everyone who has participated has felt like they have learned extensively about the topic of migration and have engaged with it. Thank you again to everyone for coming out and partaking in the 34th annual EPIIC International Symposium, and we all hope that you'll participate again next year. Thank you.